All right. So hello and welcome to today's Info2Go webinar. My name is Annie Gaines and I am the Continuing Education Consultant here at the Idaho Commission for Libraries in sunny Boise, Idaho. Our webinars and other continuing education opportunities are funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Everyone is muted and we encourage you to use the chat feature to ask questions and discuss with other attendees. As you exit the webinar, you will be prompted to complete an evaluation. And as always, we appreciate your honest feedback. Today's topic is taking care of yourself, self-care tips for trying times. And as a little self-care for myself today, I'm going to turn off my camera. Okay. So I became an advocate for self-care over the past decade or so as I figured out how to manage my own mental and emotional health while navigating grad school, becoming a professional, and various personal challenges and big life changes. Originally, I thought I had your standard issue combination anxiety and depression, the Hall & Oates of mental health disorders, but I was recently diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum, which puts a lot of things into perspective. But it's through the lens of managing my own mental health that I started wrestling with the idea of self-care. I should note that I am not the patron saint of self-care. I've just had a lot of therapy and absorbed a lot of ideas and practices, and I don't do them as much as I should. I am much better at advocating other people practice self-care than actually taking care of myself. So I guess take what I say with some grains of salt. Forgive me if you've heard this analogy before, but when you're on an airplane and the flight attendant is giving the plane the safety talk, they always explain that should the cabin lose pressure, oxygen masks will drop from the overhead area. Please place the mask over your own mouth and nose before assisting others. I've noticed that they usually visually show a parent putting on their own mask first before helping their child put on the mask. This is one analogy of self-care, prioritizing your own health and well-being first so that you can help others later. In this scenario, oxygen masks are dropped when there's an emergency and the oxygen levels are dangerously low. Although we might feel compelled to help others first, if we don't put the mask on ourselves, we won't be able to help anyone else. And this is an important motivator for those of us motivated by helping. And that totally makes sense, but that's just one analogy. Another way to think about self-care is as a scuba diver. Scuba divers use oxygen tanks to help them survive in the ocean. They must carefully check their equipment before diving, making sure to closely monitor their remaining oxygen and knowing when to take action to get themselves to safety before they run out of the air they need to survive. And scuba divers operate on a buddy system. They never dive alone. In this scenario, the oxygen isn't something to think about as part of an emergency, but rather something that's part of your regular work and everyday practice. Before engaging in the important work of helping others, before checking the news or social media, how much oxygen do I have in my tank? Is it nearly full or is it almost empty? What are the habits and practices I've put in place to fill up the tank before I start working? How much oxygen will this activity cost me? How will I know when I've reached my limit? How much oxygen will I need to reach safety? What can I do to fill the tank once I'm at the surface? And who are my diving buddies? Who has the capacity to dive alongside me and support me when I'm in trouble? Who can I share the beauty of the world I'm exploring? And who can I connect with after the dive to learn from the experience? Comparing the airplane and scuba diver metaphors, the diver has agency. The diver plans their dives, controls the depth and timeline, changes course if need be, and grows more skilled through experience. So returning from the analogies, self-care refers to the activities and practices that we can engage in on a regular basis to reduce stress and enhance our health and well-being. Or more simply, self-care is the practice of taking time to take care of ourselves. Incorporating self-care into our everyday practice creates an armor to protect the energy that we need in order to survive and thrive. And most importantly, self-care means knowing who you are and your limits. So my first piece of advice is to find a self-care buddy, an accomplice, or several. Ask this person to remind you to take your sick time or vacation time when you need it. Ask this person to remind you that your health and wellness is more important than your job, that it's okay to ask for help, that you can take time off if you need to. Ask this person to hold you accountable and maybe offer to hold them accountable as well. That way you can be self-care buddies together. I have two self-care buddies. The first is my husband. He's great. Whenever I start looking a little haggard, he will gently suggest that I use some vacation time to take a break, and he sticks with it because I'm very stubborn, and I often fail to see how much a little vacation time would really benefit my mental health. So he's self-care buddy number one. Self-care buddy number two is my therapist. I see her every 2 or 3 weeks, and she's a great advocate to have in my corner. If you're struggling during this extremely difficult time, I highly recommend reaching out to a therapist. I cannot express to you how invaluable therapy has been in my life, and so I'm a huge advocate for therapy in general. It can help you learn lifelong coping skills. It can change how you interact with people in your life in a good way. It can make you feel happier, and because you are happier, more productive. And therapy can help improve chronic stress, which is like our whole jam right now. If you have an EAP, an employee assistance program, they can help do one of the hard parts and actually set you up with a session with a local therapist pretty quickly. So you don't even have to do the work of finding one and seeing if they're accepting new patients or if they take your insurance. If you're in a more rural area and maybe there are no therapists or you're worried about small town gossip, I'd recommend these new services like BetterHelp or Talkspace. These are online therapy providers that work through video calls, regular phone calls, or just straight up instant messaging. So why is it so important to take care of yourself, especially if you're in a helping or people profession? To prevent burnout. Burnout is a state of emotional, mental, and often physical exhaustion brought on by chronic, unmanaged stress. Sometimes referred to as compassion fatigue, burnout occurs most often in people who do people work, not just library workers, but also priests, nurses, social workers, teachers, law enforcement, etc. The people who are most vulnerable to burnout are those who are highly people-oriented, those who have high expectations for themselves, and those who place a lot of their identity and life satisfaction in their work. At this point, you might be thinking that burnout is a lot like stress, and stress can lead to burnout, but they are different things. Stress is characterized by a sense of over-engagement, reactive or overactive responses, a sense of urgency and hyperactivity, lost or diminished energy, leading to anxiety. It's physically tolling, and overall just a sense of too much. Burnout is different, being characterized by disengagement, blunted or distant emotions, a sense of hopelessness, lost or diminished motivation, leading to feeling depressed or a worsening of existing mental health conditions. It's emotionally tolling. And where stress was about feeling too much, burnout is about not enough energy, not enough emotional or mental resources to just deal with things. And yes, people are asking in the chat if you'll get a copy of the slides. You will get a copy of the slides. Another way to look at it is if stress is like drowning in responsibilities, burnout is like just being dried out. So here are some of the signs and symptoms of burnout. Physically, it can have you feeling exhausted with frequent illnesses, headaches, and back pain. Also changes in your sleep or eating habits. Emotionally, it can lead to self-blame, hopelessness, and self-defeat. a feeling of I just don't care anymore, or if only I had done something. Behavioral signs and symptoms include a feeling of withdrawal and isolation, using food, drugs, or alcohol to cope, and skipping work or leaving early. That said, this list of burnout behaviors was created pre-pandemic. During the pandemic, these burnout behaviors feel like what we're all dealing with all the time. And we're still dealing with it because burnout is a normal response to a pandemic, and we're still here in the middle of a global pandemic while having to go to work, along with a push to go back to normal. So let me get on my soapbox here for a minute to say that there is no going back to how it was before the pandemic. There's this expectation that we should be able to function like we did in January of 2020, and we just can't. It's not possible to undo what has been done, to unsee what has been seen, or to forget what we've come to know. We've all lived through, and one can argue are still living through, a traumatic experience, and we can't just pretend it didn't happen. If we're being pushed to go back to normal without giving ourselves the space to process what happened, we're not setting ourselves up for productivity and success. If we just stuff down all the dark feelings we have about the pandemic in order to function, eventually that dam is going to break and we could end up in a really dark place emotionally. We may not be doing a lot of the isolating things that we were in the beginning, like staying away from our friends and family or staying home from work, but there's still the presence of a scary virus that can harm yourself or the people you care about. So emotionally, that part of the pandemic is still happening. We're still feeling like we're at risk. And as you might imagine, burnout is really prevalent right now, as these articles indicate. A recent survey by Slack found that burnout is on the rise globally, most significantly in the US, where 43% of workers reported feeling burnt out. So burnout is still relatively normal right now because we're all currently experiencing a collective traumatic experience. And as I said before, living through this pandemic has been and is a trauma, and it's important to put in perspective that our nervous systems are working really hard right now. And as a result, we're not really able to fully process everything that's happening all around us. So feeling somewhat numb and out of touch with our emotions is kind of normal, especially if you've lived through a trauma before. In-depth processing of traumatic events often happens years later when we feel emotionally safe to deal with it. When we're in the midst of a trauma, just getting by emotionally and functionally is okay. So lowering your expectations and being kind to yourself and others is really vital. And it's important to have compassion for your body and brain as it works through these changes. This is a normal response to an abnormal situation. It's normal to not be as productive as you would be. It's normal to feel a bit foggy, and these feelings all make sense in the context of our circumstances. So let's talk more about self-care. When you imagine what self-care might look like, you might picture luxurious massages or super fancy vacations. But I'd encourage you to consider low or no cost options whenever possible. Because what I'd really like to encourage you all to do is start creating a self-care toolbox. Literally or metaphorically, a collection of self-care activities, resources, and things you can reach for when you need it. So these are some of the things that go into my self-care toolbox. There are things that are literally nearby or in my backpack kind of at all times, except for the people. The people aren't in the backpack. So the first thing is fidget toys. These are small little objects that I can fidget with my hands. They come in a variety of types and sizes, and they allow me to focus some of my nervous energy into this socially acceptable thing. A common thing for me to do when I'm really anxious or stressed is to chew on my fingernails. So fidget toys are a way to redirect that energy somewhere that's less destructive. Coloring books and pencils. When I'm very, very anxious and I'm struggling to control my mind, I will often turn to coloring books. They make pretty small ones that I can fit in my bag or on my desk so they don't take up a lot of space. And they're a really helpful tool in focusing my thoughts and calming down my brain if I'm spiraling. A journal or a sketchbook is really essential for me, and it's something that I use pretty frequently. Being able to write out the anxious thoughts I'm having is a very important part of my self-care practice. It's like by writing it out, the thoughts leave my body and get placed in the journal. And so then I can have the space to think about other things. If I'm not in a safe place where I could write in my journal, which happens, or if I don't have the time, I will write out the feeling or idea or a scribble on a Post-it note so I can add it to the journal later. A Post-it note gives you a limited area to write out what you're feeling, so you're sort of giving yourself a time limit. And then once you're done, you can fold it up and put it in your pocket to add it to your journal later. People in my self-care toolbox, aside from things. So as I mentioned, my supportive husband is my #1 self-care buddy. #2 is my therapist. Sometimes they seemingly team up and give me the same advice, even though they've never met or interacted with each other in any way, and that's kind of suspicious. I also really rely on my friend group and, of course, work colleagues, and then my social media friends. So in putting together this presentation, it has become kind of normal for me to reach a point where I'm just swimming in imposter syndrome, wondering to myself, who am I to be giving this advice? I'm just a trash goblin. Who am I to be saying these things? And so I got vulnerable on the internet and I tweeted about it, just sort of explained how I was feeling. And I wasn't expecting it, but my Twitter friends came out to support me and tell me how impactful my webinars have been to them and how nice it is to work with me, just things like that. And that is one of the benefits of being vulnerable on social media. But if you're going to put yourself out there on the internet, please do so safely. We are in a time and a place where bad actors are searching for anything that could potentially embarrass us or our employers. So I would encourage you to keep your social media profiles locked down to friends and family only, just for your own safety. So actions and things to do in my self-care toolbox include redirecting emotions. So I can redirect my emotions with a short cat video, a song, or a comedy routine on YouTube. I've basically got a Rolodex of funny YouTube videos in my head that I will turn to when I need a quick boost of happiness to redirect me. It only really takes a couple of minutes, so a 2 to 4 minute video is perfect. That could be a music video, a funny skit, maybe a video of rescue kittens getting adopted and becoming great cats. Just follow the joy and curate your own Rolodex of happy videos. Question is, did your therapist teach you how to redirect my emotions? Yes, that was definitely a tool from my therapist, and she recommended the 4-minute time limit of a video to redirect emotions. So the next thing is to light a candle. Some people are candle people, and I'm definitely a candle person. There's just something nice about it. And it's a super small way to give yourself something nice, and aromatherapy is definitely a thing. I can eat or drink something. Not only does this help nourish my brain and body, which helps me to become more productive and useful, it also allows me to take a little micro break by getting up from my desk, walking over to the water cooler, chatting with someone on the way. This is a little micro break I've given to myself during the day, so good job. I can also pet a cat or a dog or look at pictures of pets. So this is the best part of working from home, is being able to walk into the other room and pet a cat whenever I want to. I mean, if the cat is willing, or just making eye contact with my dog and petting him for like 30 seconds. That will give me a boost of good feelings to help me get through the day. And I can also go for a walk. Even a 10-minute walk can help to relieve anxiety and elevate a depressed mood. According to some studies, regular exercise can work just as well as medication for some people to reduce symptoms of anxiety and depression. So these are some of the things in my self-care toolbox. So I want to take a few minutes for you all to write down some of the things that would go in your toolbox. Please grab a piece of paper and try to list things, people, and actions that you can take. It can be a mix of things you do at home and at work, like you can't really light a candle or take a bath while you're working in the library, but you could redirect your emotions with a short YouTube video or go for a quick walk. So I'm going to set a timer for 5 minutes and allow you to brainstorm. And feel free to add some self-care items in the chat if you're willing. Thanks for doing that, everybody. There's some really great suggestions in the chat that were really fun to read. It's so great to see all of your different activities. All right. So one important thing that I've learned from therapy is that our emotions serve a purpose. Say you make a mistake and you do something wrong, and you get this feeling like there's a rock in your stomach and it feels bad. That feeling, even though it doesn't feel good, is doing something important here. It's trying to teach you not to do that thing again. And it's important to feel that feeling, even if it isn't pleasant, in order to sort of process what happened and resolve to do better next time. If all you do is stuff that feeling down because it's too uncomfortable to deal with, you run the risk of making that mistake again because you didn't learn from what your emotions were telling you last time. So part of self-care is to acknowledge your emotions. You don't have to wallow in them or be consumed by them, but just touching your emotions, feeling them a little bit before shifting into maybe focusing on something else is a really important part of managing your mental health. Stuffing down our emotions isn't healthy or productive in the long term, so acknowledging our emotions becomes an essential part of self-care. One tried and true method to acknowledging and processing emotions is journaling, the practice of thinking through your emotions as you write them out. I talk a lot about the benefits of therapy, and everyone can benefit from it, but something that is even more beneficial to me is journaling. Just regularly processing out what I'm feeling on paper makes a huge difference in my mental health. And sketchbooks can do this as well. Just having a physical thing that I could pick up, express myself in, and then put back down again is a super essential thing in my life. Because just writing it down means I'm getting it out of my body, and that helps. Sort of in the same way that talking about something can help you make you feel better about that thing. Here's another way to think about our emotions. They're prompting us to productive action. So say you made some kind of ill-informed financial decision and you get that bad feeling in your stomach like, oh man, that was a really crummy thing I did. Instead of wallowing in that feeling, try to figure out what action that feeling is trying to prompt in you. You could do some research on that specific topic to learn more about how to make better financial decisions, or you could reach out to an expert on the topic, like a financial advisor, to get advice. Those are productive actions that came out of a crummy feeling, and those actions will help pull you out of that crummy feeling too. Or say we have another difficult legislative session where elected state representatives say some untrue things about the people that work in libraries. Hearing that doesn't feel good, but instead of staying in that hurt feeling, or maybe that disappointed or angry feeling, try to think of the productive action this emotion is trying to prompt in us. What would be productive in this situation? So as a library person, it feels very natural for me to offer to correct misinformation where I see it. And if someone doesn't have all the facts, it also feels very natural for me to share that information with them, because that's the job. That's what I do. So if your emotions are prompting you to productive action, one thing you can do is write to your elected representative on your own time using your own resources. I do this a lot. I have been known to send lengthy letters with citations to my elected representatives, and I find it a useful cathartic practice. When I'm feeling angry about whatever it is, I can really press hard with my pen to get that emotion in there, and it helps. And if you're too angry to write a kind and respectful letter, you can still write them an angry one, just don't send it. Processing out your feelings can be a very useful activity, as I discussed earlier with journaling. And one great method for processing feelings about people is to write them letters that you don't send them. And the not sending is important here. In order to make sure that you don't send the angry letters, you can burn them or tear them into tiny pieces for extra catharsis. So when you're feeling something intensely, you can ask yourself, what's one productive thing we can do in response to these emotions? So let's take a couple minutes here and imagine something that brought about strong feelings in you recently. What is one productive action that emotion might be prompting you to take? Feel free to write up your reflections in the chat or keep them to yourself, whichever you'd prefer. I'm going to set a 3-minute timer this time. Thanks for doing that, folks. There were some really great suggestions in the chat. All right. So before we move on to some tools on what to do with worry, I have a list of 10 tips on how to feel more engaged at work. So the first tip is to advocate for a cause. People tend to feel better when they take action. And like I mentioned earlier, sometimes our emotions are prompting us to productive action. So you can try to find something that's important to you and talk to your manager in a friendly, collaborative way about making a change. Could meetings be shorter? Could teleworking be more accessible? Could the library offer a fun social activity like a bowling league? If you get shot down, follow up to understand why. Find one thing to like or love. Our brains are designed to dwell on the negative, on what's going wrong instead of what's going right. But you can override that impulse by focusing on what you like about your job. Write it on a Post-it note and review it and update it often. That way you can see it every day. You can craft your job. The concept of job crafting, which was developed by some organizational psychologists, encourages employees to craft a job that's more appealing for them, either with the help of a manager or on their own. What part of your job do you want to do more? Maybe there's something that's not even part of your job that would make your days feel more meaningful. Studies show that when people take initiative out of a sense of curiosity and enjoyment rather than external pressure, they tend to perform better. Cultivate a best friend at work. Here's a good reason to strike up conversations with your coworkers. Research shows that employees who have a good close work friend are significantly more likely to innovate, feel engaged, and have fun on the job. You can set your intentions. Instead of setting goals, which you can feel bad about if you don't reach them, try to set intentions. These can be daily, weekly, or yearly positive intentions for yourself. For example, you might say, this year, I'm going to say no to more things. Or today, if I start to feel my blood pressure rising, I'm going to take some deep breaths and go for a short walk around the building. You can join a group. If you feel like an outsider in your workplace, look for or start a group of like-minded colleagues in a group. If your library has committees, consider joining one. If not, look for such a group outside of work. Set boundaries. With burnout so pervasive, it is super important to set boundaries around work. If you telework at all, it can be very tempting to continue working past your scheduled work hours. If that becomes a problem, enforce your boundaries by physically covering up or putting away your home workspace. You can throw a tablecloth or a sheet over your workspace, for example. Insert fun breaks. Taking even 10 minutes to do something fun can help you feel more productive afterwards, according to a study published in the Journal of Labor Economics. You could have a sketch pad by your desk for doodling, listen to energizing music, or if you're at home, play fetch with your dog. You can schedule these mini breaks on your calendar and mix it up day to day. You can make an accomplishments list. An accomplishments list serves two purposes. First, you'll feel better about yourself and boost your confidence. And second, you'll have material for your resume or your yearly evaluation. Review and update your accomplishments list weekly. And seek expert advice. If you're feeling trapped, excluded, or ready to quit, seek advice from a trusted friend, mentor, or therapist. You can work together to come up with a plan to either make your job better or come up with a plan for a job change. So now that we've talked about self-care and feeling engaged at work, I have a few tools to share with you on what to do with worry. It's normal to be worried during this time, but if you feel like it's becoming excessive and taking over your life, for example, if it's making you anxious or if you're struggling to sleep, then it might be worth trying to find ways to limit the time you spend worrying and taking steps to manage your well-being. You can practice identifying whether your worry is actionable with a worry decision tree. A worry decision tree is a helpful tool to figure out if you can do anything with what you're worrying about, and if you can't, to let it go. So the tree starts with taking a moment to think about what it is exactly you're worrying about. Then the first question is if this is a problem you can do something about. If it's a problem that you can't do anything about, like I'm worrying because the package I ordered hasn't arrived yet, there's not a whole lot I can do about that. So I can just give myself permission to let that worry go and focus on something else that's more important to me right now. If it is something that I can do something about, like say I'm worried about finishing a project on time, there's definitely things that I can do that would help, right? So if yes, work on what you would do and list out your options. If I'm worried about completing a project on time, I could schedule focus time to work on this specific project, blocking out that time on my schedule to encourage me to work on it, or I could ask for help from one of my colleagues. The next step in the tree is to ask if there's anything on that list that I can do right now. If there is, I should go ahead and do it now and then let that worry go and focus on something else. If not, I could plan out what to do and when I'll do it, mark it on my calendar, and then let that worry go so that I can focus on something else. You can see how valuable of a tool this could be. So say you've got a lot of worried thoughts. This decision tree allows you to kind of pick up each one, examine if there's any actionable solutions to your worry, and then move on with your day, which can be really helpful. We can also practice postponing worry. This might sound kind of silly, but it's possible to postpone your worries to a later specific time to worry about them. This tool can be a helpful way to renegotiate your relationship with worry. The first step is to decide when your worry time will be and for how long. Your worry time is the time you set aside every day for the specific purpose of worrying. Is there a time of day that would be better suited, or when you're unlikely to be disturbed? If you're unsure where to start, try 15 to 30 minutes at say 7 o'clock every day. The second step is to postpone your worries. So during the day, decide whether the worries that surface are actionable worries that you can act on now, or whether they are more hypothetical ones that could be postponed. This relies on the decision tree idea of worry management that we talked about before. If you can't take an action now, postponing the worry about it till worry time, and most importantly, redirect your attention to the present. You can say, I'm not going to engage in this worry right now. I'll worry about this later. The third step is to use your dedicated worry time for worrying. You might consider writing down any worries that come up during the day that you're postponing to worry time. That way you can make sure you get through them all. And now that you're in your dedicated worry time, this is your time to worry as much as you need to. You can also use this time to figure out if any of the worries can lead you to practical actions. Another tool you can use is using compassionate thoughts to challenge negative thinking through journaling. So say you're journaling, you can divide up a page into 4 sections. One for the situation, one for the feelings, one for the thoughts, and one for the compassionate response. And the idea here is to sort of think through the negative thoughts you might be having, and then crafting a really compassionate response to yourself that would make you feel better. This is just a template. So here's an example from the source I was looking at. The situation was watching the news for a second hour in a row. The emotions were anxiety and an increasing sense of panic. The negative thought that this is really terrible, so many people could die, what about me and my family? And the compassionate response is it's understandable that you're worried. It would be unusual not to be. What's the best thing you can do for yourself to feel better right now? Maybe you could watch a comedy instead of the news, or get up and do something else productive. So that's an example of using compassionate thoughts through journaling. So with these 10 tips and those tools, that is the presentation I have for you today. I'd love to use the rest of the time to answer any questions you might have or to hear your great suggestions for self-care activities. And how are you going to be managing your stress in the upcoming months? Thanks for coming, everybody. I really appreciate you. Great. Okay, so I will be following up over email with a link to the recording. As you exit this webinar, you'll be prompted to complete an evaluation, and we always appreciate your honest feedback. I hope you all have an excellent week and an excellent springtime. It'll be springtime soon. And when I share the recording, I'll also share the slides and any resources that were shared in the chat as well.